The first lesson, I think, is one of the most interesting scenes in the book of Acts, where Paul goes to the city of Athens to preach on the Areopagus. In the city of Athens, that great city of philosophers, the city of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the city of the University of Athens, one of the great learning centers of the ancient world. In the center of the city, of course, is the Acropolis with the Parthenon on top of it. Just to the northwest of the Acropolis, there's a little valley, and then there's another little outcropping. That is called the Areopagus. And the Areopagus is where the students from all of the philosophical schools all through the city, the students and the professors, the writers, the thinkers would gather on the Acropolis, this outdoor, open-air space, and they would argue about whose philosophy was right and whose philosophy was better and whose philosopher was smarter than the other philosopher. And in the first lesson, Paul goes to the Areopagus, not to talk about some interesting philosophy, but to talk about Jesus. And we get a couple of interesting insights into what Paul is trying to do there. First of all, by how he approaches Athens, it is clear that he did not just go straight into Athens with blinders on his eyes and go straight to the Acropolis and start arguing with people. It is clear that he did his homework, that he spent some time going in and through the city. Because the first thing he says to these gathered philosophers in front of them is that he saw an altar in the city that had an inscription on it to an unknown God. And he uses that as an opportunity to say, this God who you say is unknown, I'm telling you that you can know him, and I know him, and you can too. Which tells me he walked around, right? He also did his own homework by reading the philosophers that they were reading. And we know that because he quotes them in his speech to them. In the end of the first large paragraph in chapter 17, he says, "For in him we live and move and have our being." He didn't make those words up. He is quoting the pagan Stoic philosopher Epimenides. A few verses later, he says, "For we too are his offspring." He didn't make that up either. He's quoting from the pagan Stoic philosopher Aratus. The main philosophical school in Athens at the time was the Stoic school. Stoics believed that there was a God, but they thought the idea of like a personal deity with like gender and personality was silly. That all the tales of the Greco-Roman gods, with all their various petty jealousies and relationships and stabbing each other in the back, thought that was ridiculous. They believed that there was a God, but it was sort of like this impersonal force that you could tap into by rational thought. Which is why when we talk about someone being stoic, it's someone who sort of like puts away their emotions and is just going by rational thought. Paul has read these Stoic philosophers and is able to use their words sort of against them. He says, "For in him we live and move and have our being," says Epimenides. In him. He's like, your guy Epimenides seems to talk about God as a him, as a person who we can engage with. And then he quotes Aratus, "For we too are his offspring." That doesn't sound like a general force out there in the universe. It sounds like a personal God. If he had walked to the Areopagus and said, "Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 4 or Isaiah chapter 40, no one there would have had a Genesis or an Isaiah or would even know what he was talking about. Those were texts that were authoritative for Paul and for his people, but they weren't authoritative for this audience of philosophers in the city of Athens. And so instead of starting in his home base, he starts in theirs. The second thing I think that is going on in this passage is that it's an answer to a question. And we see this question be asked in the late 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd and 4th century Christianity. And the question is our religion, this thing we call Christianity, is it just a backwoods religion of illiterate carpenters and fishermen from the Galilee region, a 2 days walk from the nearest city? Like, is this just a backwater thing? Or is there something here? Is there something deeper? Would people who were read and erudite, could they possibly be interested in this thing that we're putting our lives into? And you see different Christians sort of wrestling with this question. And that question seems to be exactly what Paul is answering here. Just put yourself in the shoes of a late 1st century, early 2nd century Christian. Your religion is small. Your religion is illegal. You're not allowed to have it in the open. You're not welcome in the synagogues. You're not welcome in pagan Gentile society. Everyone's sort of laughing at you about this thing. And someone laughs at you enough, you begin to think, is there something worth laughing about? And then you hear that Paul took this religion to the Areopagus. This thing, you've never been there, you'll never go there. You've only heard about it in tales that your grandparents talked about. This place where the smartest, the most well-read people gather. Paul took it there. And how was it received? Our first lesson this morning, unfortunately, cut off right before we find out how his speech went over. Acts says, when they heard, talking about the philosophers, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, we will hear you again about this. At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. Imagine being that late 1st century, 2nd century Christian and hearing that Paul, your guy, went to the Areopagus, spoke about Jesus, and some people were like, we're interested in hearing more, and a handful of people are like, we're in. This would have been incredible validation for those Christians. That serious people. That you can be a fisherman, but you can also be a philosopher. And you can love Jesus. I think that validation was helpful 2,000 years ago. I think it's also helpful today. I've been a priest for over 2 decades now, and I've had a lot of conversations with people that begin with, so what do you do? I'm a priest. And usually that conversation goes, oh, what did I say in front of you? Oh my gosh. And sometimes they'll tell me where they go to church, but sometimes, and I've had this happen like frequently, they'll say something like, that's nice for you, I believe in science. As if I'm like a Bronze Age caveman or something. I try not to put that look on my face. Just like some of the greatest thinkers of Paul's day were taken by the message of Jesus, some of the greatest minds of our own day are taken by Jesus. I want to just introduce you to a few. There's a woman named Jing Kang. She's a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. She's known worldwide for her work on nanotechnology. She says, quote, "The research is only a platform for me to do God's work." She sees her work in nanotechnology as an extension of her ministry. Russell Coburn, professor of experimental physics at Cambridge University and also a world authority on nanotechnology, says, quote, "God got there first. Nature is full of nanotechnology. Everything from the smallest molecules to supermassive black holes is part of God's creative activity." Daniel Hastings, another guy from MIT, this time in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, says, "There is a God who created the universe, and he's not an impersonal God. He has declared himself as a loving God who seeks a relationship with us." William Newsom, professor of neurobiology at Stanford and a world expert on cognitive neuroscience, says, quote, "Your faith should be informed by science. It should not be replaced by science. Science can't bear that weight." If you've been around here long enough, you've probably heard me speak of Francis Collins, who's a PhD and an MD. He ran the Human Genome Project, one of the great scientific achievements of the last 50 years, and that's saying something. He was also the head of the National Institute of Health. He was sort of a reflexive atheist. He's just like, I'm a scientist, I'm not going to believe this thing. And then he speaks about his conversion by saying that he realized as a scientist, he was discounting something without looking at the evidence. He's like, that's not what a scientist does. A scientist looks at the evidence. And he went and he looked at the evidence, and for him, it pointed him to God. And so now he's not only a world expert on biology and immunology, but he also goes around talking about the interplay between science and religion. There's Martin Rees, who was the last astronomer royal in Great Britain. He was the science advisor to the Court of Windsor and professor and master of Trinity College, Cambridge. He wrote a book called Just Six Numbers on the fine-tuning of the universe, the numbers which ground reality and make life possible. And he is in his little Church of England church every single Sunday. There's John Polkinghorne, who has a doctorate in quantum field theory from Cambridge, and then another doctorate from Cambridge in theoretical elementary particle physics. That was my old job. So he's teaching full-time. He's one of the brightest minds at Cambridge, and then he became a priest in the Church of England. He had a little tiny parish church, and then he had his students. He wrote, I love this, "God is not a God of the edges with a vested interest in beginnings. God is the God of the whole show." Like when we talk about God, we can't just talk about creation or Big Bang or things like that. God is God of everything, from the first moment to this moment to the last moment. There's a woman, Kizzmekia Corbett. She led the team to develop the COVID-19 mRNA vaccine, partnering with Moderna and the NIH. She's a professor at Harvard and a worldwide name in immunology. She says this, "Actually, before a scientist, I'm a Christian." And then she adds, "And I'm sassy, and I'm bright, and I'm fashionable." Yeah. And these are just some of the modern minds that are with us today, before we even get to Galileo, or Francis Bacon, who discovered the scientific method, or Isaac Newton, who did gravity, or Michael Faraday, who with his work in electromagnetic induction, or Blaise Pascal and his probability theory, or Lord Kelvin with the first two laws of thermodynamics, or Werner Heisenberg, one of the creators of quantum mechanics, all of them devout Christians. We can give our hearts and lives to Jesus, and we can also give our minds to Jesus without giving up everything else. Some of the greatest minds of our age and every age have done what we are doing right here and in our lives. This faith is for the carpenter and the fisherman and the quantum physicist and everyone in between. And all of us can, with Paul and Epimenides, say, in him we live and move and have our being. Amen.